During the last months of the war, the North Sea was unstable, its heavy swells reducing visibility and masking sound. On one of those nights, an Allied sonar station registered something it had never seen before, a submerged contact moving slowly, deliberately, almost as if it were tracing a pattern across the ocean floor. The pulses were faint but unmistakably artificial, too controlled to be drifting debris, too strategic to be a distressed U-boat. Then, just as abruptly as it appeared, the contact vanished, slipping beneath the noise of the sea as if it had never been there at all. Hours later, fragments of thin-gauge metal washed up along a remote Norwegian shoreline. The shards were clearly German, yet too small and curved to match any known submarine class. Allied analysts highlighted the reports, trying to determine how a vessel could exist that no intelligence file had ever mentioned. While the Allies searched for answers, Berlin offered nothing. No missing crew reports, no equipment losses, no explanation. Tonight's story follows the operation behind that silence, an underwater mission Germany never acknowledged. Keep watching, because the deeper this case goes, the more the evidence begins to align. And if you want more untold wartime investigations, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. By the final phase of the war, German Naval Command faced a problem that was becoming impossible to hide. Allied convoy protection had grown far more effective. Escort ships moved in tight formations, long-range sonar networks scanned the major routes, and constant air patrols covered the gaps that had once given U-boats a chance. Every passing month made it harder for Germany's underwater fleet to operate without being detected, cornered, or destroyed. Inside this growing pressure, small groups of Kriegsmarine engineers pushed forward with experimental ideas that operated outside the formal chain of command. One of the most secluded efforts ran from a hidden facility built deep into the rock walls of a Norwegian fjord. It was isolated, quiet, and rarely visited by senior officers. This allowed the engineers to work with fewer restrictions, testing technology that would not have passed through Berlin's approval process. Their focus was a combination of miniature submarine hulls and early acoustic mapping equipment, devices designed to listen rather than attack. Some components were modeled after captured Allied technology, while others came from improvised designs and modified industrial instruments. The goal was to chart Allied convoy routes using sound signatures at different depths, hoping to identify patterns or gaps that the main fleet could exploit. The prototype vessel was small, quiet, and fitted with sensors far more sensitive than those found on standard U-boats. It was intended to move through deeper channels, record underwater signals, and return without ever being noticed. But the program was unofficial, built on vague orders, unlogged shipments, and personnel reassigned under generic technical codes. That ambiguity made it nearly invisible in the records, and easy to deny later. It was in this hidden corner of the war that a mission took shape which Germany would never acknowledge. Keep watching, because the men chosen for it left behind traces that tell a story their own navy refused to put on paper. Among the surviving documents connected to the fjord facility, a small cluster of technical notes and personnel lists mentions two men whose involvement became the central clue to the mission. The first was Hans Brenner, a marine acoustics engineer with experience analyzing underwater frequency distortion. His work focused on how weather systems and shifting thermoclines altered long-range sonar returns. The second was Otto Weiss, a mechanical technician who had spent much of the war modifying battery systems and pressure-resistant housings for small-scale submersibles. Both men appear repeatedly in maintenance logs, calibration sheets, and requisition forms from the final winter of the conflict. Technical records from the site describe an unexpected finding made during a series of controlled acoustic tests. Brenner identified irregular intervals in Allied sonar reports, brief blind zones caused by turbulent weather fronts that bent sound waves in specific patterns. These distortions created temporary gaps in detection coverage. If accurately mapped, they could reveal narrow corridors where a vessel might move without being tracked. A series of urgent equipment requests soon followed. Logs show orders for reinforced battery cells, extra oxygen scrubbers, emergency diving tools, and upgraded pressure valves. These items were not typically associated with short-range tests inside the fjord. Instead, they matched preparations for a prolonged underwater deployment. Personnel assignment notes, written in plain language but lacking any official authorization codes, list Brenner and Weiss as the technicians responsible for operating the prototype submarine during this critical testing phase. Their names disappear from later documentation, and no transfer orders exist. The last confirmed entry is a signed calibration sheet dated in the final weeks of the war, indicating that both men completed a full system check shortly before the vessel left the facility. The cumulative evidence suggests that Brenner and Weiss were chosen specifically because their expertise matched the mission's requirements: deep water navigation, advanced acoustic monitoring, and the ability to improvise under uncertain conditions. When the prototype submarine left the hidden fjord facility, no formal records documented its departure. The launch appears to have taken place at night, consistent with minimizing detection from Allied aircraft patrolling the Norwegian coastline. The vessel was designed for low acoustic output, using reduced vibration motors and insulated equipment mounts. These features aligned with the mission's purpose: collect underwater sound data without drawing attention. Allied listening stations later recorded an unidentified contact moving at an unusual depth for a small craft. Reports describe a steady, deliberate pattern, changes in speed and heading, that suggested the operator was following predetermined points rather than reacting to pursuit. The object moved through deeper channels where temperature layers interfered with standard sonar, an environment ideal for acoustic mapping work. Inside the submarine, Brenner and Weiss would have rotated through a strict routine: battery level checks, oxygen monitoring, and manual tuning of the experimental sensors. Space was limited, forcing them to work within arm's reach of every system. The mission profile required them to stay submerged longer than typical midget submarines, relying entirely on battery power until surfacing became unavoidable. Allied logs indicate that the contact briefly ascended to a shallower layer before dropping sharply. The final sonar return ended with a sudden loss of clarity, consistent with either a rapid descent beyond detection range or an unexpected mechanical failure. No corresponding radio traffic was ever intercepted, reinforcing that the craft operated under complete silence. From the available data, the mission continued just long enough to gather initial readings, before disappearing entirely from the acoustic record. In the weeks following the submarine's disappearance, the fjord facility entered an abrupt shutdown. Personnel were reassigned without explanation. Equipment was boxed and removed, and several storage rooms were emptied before investigators could document their contents. None of these actions appear in official wartime records, but surviving administrative notes confirm that the site ceased operations in a compressed time frame unusual for naval research units. When Allied investigators reached the location after the war, they catalogued several anomalies. Near the waterline, they recovered the distorted remains of a small hull section built from thin-gauge alloy consistent with late-war German experimental manufacturing. Its curvature matched no known U-boat class. In adjacent storage areas, they found water-damaged pages containing fragments of acoustic mapping diagrams and incomplete component lists. None of the documents carried signatures from senior officers, suggesting the project operated without full authorization. Meanwhile, Allied naval intelligence cross-checked their own wartime sonar logs. One entry, dated to the final winter of the conflict, described an unidentified submerged contact tracked for a short period before disappearing into deeper water. The timing aligned with the estimated date of the fjord shutdown, providing the strongest correlation between the two events. No German records mention Brenner or Weiss after their final calibration sheet. They do not appear on casualty lists, transfer reports, or post-war remnant files. Their absence reinforced the suspicion that the mission, and its outcome, had been deliberately removed from the official history. Keep watching, because the final piece of this story reveals why silence may have been the intended result. The fragments of evidence surrounding the unregistered submarine form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. Technical logs, improvised equipment orders, and hurried personnel movements point to a project operating on the margins of official authorization. The discovery of a warped hull near the fjord confirms that a small vessel existed, constructed using methods consistent with late-war German experimentation. Allied sonar records support the presence of a submerged craft whose behavior did not match standard U-boat tactics. None of these elements alone prove the mission occurred as reconstructed, but together they create a consistent framework of activity that suggests a deliberate attempt at underwater reconnaissance. The absence of documentation on Brenner and Weiss after the final calibration sheet remains one of the strongest indicators of concealment. In regular naval operations, even unauthorized missions typically generated administrative traces, transfer orders, casualty reports, or posthumous record entries. Their disappearance from all subsequent files reflects a level of removal that required institutional cooperation, whether formal or informal. Historians studying the final months of the war often note that Germany, facing collapse, turned increasingly to isolated research groups working without oversight. In that environment, missions could be sent out quickly, executed quietly, and erased without debate if they failed. The underwater operation appears to fit that pattern: a narrow window of opportunity, a risky test, and an outcome no authority wished to acknowledge. What remains today are only hints, enough to outline the shape of a mission that officially never happened, carried out by men whose names survived only in the margins of technical notes.